My name is John Sorrow, and I'm the Deputy Director for Science, Technology, and Engineering at Los Alamos. I'm thrilled to see so many of you here. We're already up to over 70 folks participating and rising quickly. And I think what's most exciting for me is a bunch of the names I recognize, but a bunch of the names I don't recognize. And that means we're making new community and new partnerships and new collaborations, and that's really exciting. Before we dive in, I also want to acknowledge our colleagues at Sandia National Laboratories who are joining us in co-hosting this workshop. We're looking forward to spending time together on the topic of water and energy. And before I get really started, I want to also thank all the folks who helped organize this meeting and the whole iWest community for coming together. It's an interesting observation. I'm actually at an investment conference today wearing a different one of my hats. And it's encouraging, I would say, that in that community, the theme of energy and energy transitions has already arisen. They've also already figured out that water is relevant. I'm not sure they've quite gotten to the fact that water and energy actually mix, and there are sort of technology tensions and technology transitions that have to be understood. So I'll report back later whether they actually figured out those connections. I would say the good news is this community has figured this out. And so certainly one part of today's discussion is understanding how energy technologies and water either constructively or sometimes destructively interfere, that there are consequences for our water systems from energy transition that we need to be very cognizant of. And so we'll spend some time on that. But I think personally the thing that's even more important than the technical side of the discussion, and the thing that iWest in general has tried to focus on, and certainly this workshop is focused on, is how do you take that conversation local? How do we engage with a variety of stakeholders, a variety of communities, and really understand in a very local, very regional way, what are the consequences, what are the implications, what are the needs? And so that's how we're going to spend our time over the course of the workshop. It's really exciting to see you all here. So again, we've got some great speakers lined up. Thank you to all the speakers for their remarks, but also thanks to all of you. We've tried to engineer throughout the agenda time for discussion. We really want to hear from all of your diverse perspectives and diverse voices. So please don't be shy in sharing your perspectives during the conversation. In addition, as complete as this conversation will be because of all the perspectives all of you will bring, surely there'll be more to talk about once we're done. And so I recommend to all of you the iWest website, iwest.org, where you can both see previous events we've hosted, related parts of the conversation, and we'll also continue the dialogue from our water and energy, how do they mix conversation. So with that, I'll close. Again, I'll thank you all for joining, and I'll turn it over to Jolanta Van Beek, who will carry on the conversation and frame the rest of the workshop. So Jolanta, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Next slide, please, Crystal. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes to give you a brief overview on what the iWest initiative goals are and some logistics of this workshop. So my name is Jolanta van Wijk, and I work at Los Alamos National Laboratory. Next slide, please. So the iWest initiative is looking at an equitable energy transition in the Intermountain West region. The map towards the right shows the 6 states that are included in this Intermountain West region, and this region also includes the sovereign nations. The objectives of the iWest initiative are twofold. In the first place, we are developing a stakeholder-based technology roadmap to achieve carbon neutrality in this area. And the second objective is to build regional coalitions to deploy this roadmap. As you can see, our approach is rather unique. We have a place-based approach, and that means that we are strongly considering non-technological aspects in this region. For example, the policy landscape, the revenue and jobs, the workforce that is available and can be developed, equity, energy, and environmental justice, etc., etc. And as you can imagine, and we'll talk more about that this morning, in an energy transition, there's multiple technologies involved, and together they will form multiple symbiotic energy economies. So later today, we'll look at carbon capture, utilization, and storage, for example, clean hydrogen, bioenergy, and low carbon electricity. Next slide, please. So the iWest initiative has many partners from all these 6 states and the sovereign nations, and some of them are listed here on this slide. Also, we are sponsored by the Department of Energy, and this iWest initiative is led by Los Alamos National Laboratory. This workshop today is organized in collaboration with Sandia National Laboratories in Albuquerque. Next slide, please. So why are we organizing this workshop? You may know that the energy sector in the United States uses about 3.5 trillion gallons of fresh water per year. And this is not insignificant. This is about 10% of the US water consumption. And therefore, it's really important for us when we're talking about an energy transition and starting to deploy new technologies to understand how water comes into the equation. So water is an important factor in the energy transition. As John just mentioned, we have close to about 200 registered participants for this workshop, and they come from many different backgrounds. In the first place, the Department of Energy is represented here, national laboratories, and many universities. But also we have representations from investment companies, consulting and engineering companies, and energy companies, and we have representations from advocacy groups and city and state governments. Further, there are individuals here, concerned citizens, and people who are just interested in learning more about this topic. Next slide, please. So this workshop consists of 3 segments, segment 1, segment 2, and segment 3, followed by an open mic. Segment 1 focuses on water usage today and into the future in the Intermountain West region. Segment 2 focuses on a tour of low-carbon technology water, and segment 3 is about emerging opportunities in non-traditional water usage. Between segment 2 and segment 3, there will be a short break, and each segment consists of short presentations, lightning talks or short talks, followed by roundtable discussions. We would like to invite you to use the chat to enter your suggestions and comments, and throughout this workshop, we will monitor the chat and we'll pull up questions from the chat at the start of each roundtable discussion. Then at around 11:30, we'll have the start of our open mic, and this is your opportunity to be heard if you have additional suggestions or comments. And then I'll aim to adjourn around noon, and all these times are in Mountain. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the logistics, because we are with so many here, we would like to invite you to use the chat. So you can use the chat to enter your suggestions or comments or questions. And again, we will monitor the chat, and we are also recording the chat. So even if we don't get to your question or comment today, at a later point in time, we will read everything that has been entered into the chat, and we will take that into our discussions going forward. We will also like to ask you to raise your virtual hand if you have a question in a roundtable discussion, for example, and then we'll call upon you. Next slide, please. Finally, please remember to mute yourself. So please remain muted unless you are asking a question, for example, and don't forget to mute yourself after you are done speaking. We'd like to kindly ask you to keep the agenda and time limits in mind. We only have 3 hours, and there's many topics to address. And we would like to invite you to help foster a respectful conversation where everybody can be heard. As you have just seen, we're here with many different people from different backgrounds, so please keep this in mind. If you have further questions or comments or would like to talk to us further after today's workshop, you can contact us at iwest@lano.gov. That is our email address towards the right. Towards the left, we also have a web page at www.iwest.org. So with that, next slide, please. I would like to hand this over to the moderators of our first segment. And they are Nicole Jackson, and Peter Kobos, both from Sandia National Labs. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. So I don't know how I got in the kickoff position here, but thank you very much. And thanks to all the organizers for doing this and including us in this. So I'm going to give a quick rundown on the energy water nexus. If we go to the next slide. So the objective I thought for this talk was really to, again, just kind of give a nice high level view of the energy water nexus and what is it, why do we care? and also help to develop an understanding of the interconnectedness of water to everything else. And I think this is a key point when we talk about energy, water carbon, energy, water, climate, is that water is not for a pun, but it permeates everything. So, but I also like to be able to lay the foundation for further dialogue, both during this workshop and beyond. So go to the next slide, please. So the key points here is that energy, water, climate, these issues are happening now, and these are multi-sector impacts. It also includes human and environmental systems, other infrastructure. And if we don't pay attention to these issues are going to intensify both in their magnitude, but also in their frequency. And to be able to moderate these issues is going to require adaptation. But that becomes very difficult because we have a changing energy portfolio as the renewables come online. We have a changing water portfolio. I put that in quotes because really it's the water cycle that is changing over time with climate change. And so if we're looking at a carbon neutral future, we need to look at it from a systems perspective and to try and understand what the unintended consequences would be as we try to adapt to some of these. And the key point again is that these systems are linked with multiple feedback loops. So we need to understand how these things are connected and what these feedback loops mean in terms of the dynamics of the system. So go ahead to the next one. So you need water to create and access energy. So on the left, we have a nice graphic from the USGS, and thanks for the USGS being around because we get to use these great graphics that they have. But if this shows the U.S. water withdrawals, this is from 2015, for all the various sectors in the United States. If you notice, thermoelectric is the highest withdrawal of water of any sector. Now that changes when we look at consumption. And I noticed that my numbers here are a little different than some other numbers that were quoted earlier. And that's because consumption is very difficult to estimate. But the point being is that in terms of consumption, thermoelectric is actually fairly small. But that still means that we have to have the water available for the cooling and these once-through type processes that thermoelectric uses it for. So as thermoelectric changes, that's going to change that dynamic associated with the water use. We'll go to the next slide. And the other side of the coin is you also need energy for water. So the water sector itself represents about 4 to 8% of the total U.S. energy consumption. And that comes from pumping water for irrigation, most of that groundwater. Also for treatment, both on the front end, for instance, in desalination, but also in the back end in sewage treatment. And also in conveyance, especially here in the West, in the I-West region. We tend to move water, in interbasin transfers and things like that. As an example, irrigation of itself for pumping groundwater requires about 455 kilowatt hours per acre foot pumped on average across the West. So it's not a trivial amount of power that's needed. And as these groundwater levels drop, the power required to access the deeper groundwaters goes up. So next slide, please. The other thing I want to point out is that water is place-based. So again, got to thank the USGS for these great graphics. In the upper left, I'm sorry it's not very large, but I want to concentrate on the yellow bars. This is the water withdrawal for thermoelectric power. And then also the blue line on top of that. So the blue line is the total withdrawals in the U.S. For water use across all sectors. The yellow bars are the use for thermoelectric. And you can see over the last 10, 15 years that we've had a decline as we've learned how to be more efficient in our cooling systems with thermoelectric. So this is providing opportunity for freeing up water for other uses. And I won't go through all these maps, but what I wanted to point out with this, as you look at it, we have total withdrawals, we have the public supply, irrigation in the lower left, thermoelectric power in the middle lower, and mining on the right. I should point out that mining also includes water required for oil and gas extraction. But the thing to point out is that depending on the use, the pattern, the liters in the water use changes quite a bit. So it's no surprise that, for instance, like thermoelectric, Texas is a big water user, and also in mining, you see quite a bit in the West, where New Mexico, Wyoming, Texas, Utah, Nevada, California are very large water users in that area. But again, these not only is it place-based, but it's also dependent on the sector that's accessing that water. So we'll go to the next one. And the other thing is that watersheds don't follow political boundaries. So this is just a map of the Western U.S. Showing the major watersheds overlaying on top of that without the state boundaries. So it becomes very muddled. It's very hard to see the state boundaries. And the thing to point out here is that water management is very hierarchical. So you have the federal entities, for instance, the USGS, which looks at water quantity. You have the EPA that looks at water quality. You have the Army Corps of Engineers that looks at water transportation and flood mitigation. You have the Bureau of Rec that looks at hydroelectric power generation. But then you also have state entities, and you also have county entities, and you also have city and local. And most of the day-to-day management is done at the local scale, but the large sort of policy types of changes are done more at the state and federal level. So it becomes a very difficult resource to create change in how it's handled. The other thing I want to point out, and I don't mean this to be a joke, but water flows downhill, right? So my sewage is your supply. And what that brings up is you end up having competing interests. So not only on the water quality side, so it's my responsibility to clean up my water use so that you can have a reliable water supply downstream from me, but also competing interests. So, and we see this right now, say between New Mexico and Texas, where, in the Rio Grande Compact, there's not enough water going into Texas, and there's all kinds of legal issues that are arising out of it. And these are competing interests that we have to look at. And in this case, sometimes the water is just not available. And again, we see that in the Colorado Basin now. It's unprecedented. So next slide, please. I think one thing to point out that I think is really important in terms of energy, water, and climate change is that the climate change is really going to manifest itself through hydrologic changes in the hydrologic cycle. So earlier spring runoff, more intense storms, and changes in for instance, when the monsoons show up, when the rainy seasons show up, things like that. It also affects both the supply and the demand side. So as these water cycle timings and intensities change, and the temperature rises, we see changes in both the supply, the availability of the water, and the demand of the water, and in the demand for energy, which again is that feedback loop to requiring more water. And so when we look at water's role in a carbon neutral future, again, we have to look at how all these different technologies can influence and impact these changing resources over time. So next slide, please. And so, we keep hammering on the same concept, but water has an amazing diverse role in our existence, really. So, it's used in raw materials and byproducts through produced water that we get from oil and gas extraction. Very important to ecosystems and ecosystem services. A key point is that it's a receptor of pretty much all the pollution that we generate tends to flow downhill into the oceans. Also for irrigation, energy, and things like that. So it has a very wide-ranging use in just about every aspect of our life. So next slide, please. And because of that, if we're going to look at the energy, water, carbon nexus, we have to realize that this is a highly interdisciplinary subject area. So we have to understand hydrology, but we also have to understand ecology and chemistry and system dynamics and climate science and all these other different things. and many more that aren't even listed here. So it's not a simple, when you start putting these multi-sector problems together, it's not a simple sort of in and out type of assessment that we look at. We have to really understand how all these things are connected through the different systems and feedbacks that occur. And one more slide. And so I just thought I would throw out a few questions just to start mulling, people can start mulling over in their heads. So first is that, you know, as we reallocate water that's been previously used for thermoelectric for other things like hydrogen or so on, what's kind of transfer issues do we have? Is the water that's being used in one spot available in another spot? What type of infrastructure do we need to support the integration of things like desal and hydrogen production? How can we best manage the produced brine and saline water treatment? Because that also requires energy. What about uncertainty? This is another big issue, both in you know, the climate forecasts and water cycles, but also in pricing and availability and things like that, and the demand side of things. And then how do we support those assumptions to help with that uncertainty? And then finally, how does all this vary by location? So even in the I-West states, there's huge variability in terms of the water cycle and the energy use and the water use. And if you look at that on a national basis, it's even more extreme. So does it vary by location, and does it vary over time? Is that varying both spatial and temporal? So with that, one more slide. I will say thank you, and I wish everybody a terrific workshop and look forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom, for that great overview to tee up the segment. Next up, we have Bruce Thompson from the University of New Mexico, who's going to give us a current look at water energy in the Intermountain West with a case study of the Permian Basin. The floor is yours, Bruce. Looks like you're muted, Bruce.
I apologize. Can we go to the next slide? Yes, so much of what the first couple slides cover were discussed by Tom. My focus is on New Mexico because that's what I know, but New Mexico and the Southwest have major role in the nation's energy supplies. We have fossil fuels as well as nuclear fuels. We major sources of wind, solar, and bioenergy. Lots of opportunities for large-scale energy storage, and of course, waste disposal, which is a important aspect of the energy cycle. So let's go to the next slide. This is from a study that the folks at Sandia, led by Mike Hightower, did about 15, 18 years ago. And I'm not going to go into it, but it just, they identify energy extraction and production, refining and processing, transportation and generation. And the gray boxes are aspects of the energy cycle that have major components in the Intermountain West. So next slide. Again, electric power generation, thermoelectric, hydroelectric, nuclear, solar PV and wind, and so forth. So the Intermountain West, and especially the arid Southwest, has a huge role in the production of energy. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to talk about is sort of a case study. This is New Mexico, and I'm going to focus on the Permian Basin and the relationship between oil, gas, and water. And there's this is what I know. I don't know very much about the energy production and oil, gas, and water in the other states except Colorado and Wyoming. But the Permian Basin, of course, New Mexico is a major producer of oil and gas. And so I think this is relevant to our discussion. the one caveat listed there at the bottom is that most of this data is a year old, and due to the explosion of the oil and gas industry, it's somewhat dated. Next slide, please. So this is just a map of New Mexico showing the river basins on the left and showing the oil and gas producing regions on the right. Upper northwest is where we've principally got gas production. That's the San Juan Basin, and the southeast is the Permian. And it's principally oil, but there's a lot of gas as well. So next slide, please. And this shows the water resources in the state of New Mexico. We have total withdrawals of about 3 million acre feet. An acre foot is a third of a million gallons of water. There was a question on the chat. What's the difference between consumption and withdrawal? Withdrawal is taking water from a resource, whether it's surface water or groundwater. Consumption is the difference between what you withdraw and what you return to the environment. So a once through thermoelectric power plant takes the water, runs it through their cooling system, runs it to cool the generators, and then dumps it back in. So the difference between what they take and what they return is consumptive use. The numbers here in the lower right hand corner in that pie chart are the total withdrawals, 3 million acre feet, and about half of that in New Mexico is surface water, and half of that is groundwater. Next slide, please. And so what I wanted to show you was this is the Pecos River, which runs along the western boundary of the Permian Basin, and as it crosses the state line, that's at Malaga, that's the USGS gauge there, something around 70,000 acre feet of water flows across the state line on average, but 10% of the time it's a third of that, it's 25,000 acre feet. And so that sort of illustrates the high variability. And because of this continual shortages and threats of drought, it's the subject of numerous lawsuits between Texas and New Mexico. Next slide. So this is the Permian Basin. Upper right-hand corner is the entire basin. The lower left-hand corner is the New Mexico side of the basin. And you can see there's a tremendous number of oil and gas wells and saltwater disposal wells and others. But it's a very, very productive region, in part because it's very deep. There are 5 or 6 major oil and gas producing layers in the Permian Basin. Next slide, please. So this shows the production. On the left, it's the Permian Basin oil and gas production. On the right, it's the San Juan Basin. And red is gas production, green is oil production. And you can see that oil production, well, they're both practically asymptotic, and it continues today with the price upwards over $130 a barrel. So, I mean, it's just a tremendous challenge to manage the industry, its water needs, and the produced water. So let's go to the next slide. So one of the things that has attracted a lot of attention from the public is fracking, hydraulic fracturing, where you pump water under very high pressures in order to fracture the rock, which increases the permeability. It's a short-term operation, typically takes less than a week, uses a very large volume of water, but it's a one-time operation. And in New Mexico side, those pictures are of water purveyors, and there are a number of outfits down there that make a lot of money, or have made a lot of money, selling water to the oil and gas companies for hydraulic fracturing. Next, please. Oh, one point I want to make on that last one is when the public talks about fracking, they often confuse fracking with everything that goes along with oil and gas production, exploration, development, pumping and production, and produce water and things like that. So one of the things there, until recently, there wasn't much data on the sources of water for fracking. In late 2020, I believe it was October, the state of New Mexico passed a new regulation that required the oil and gas companies to report the source of water for their fracking. The red is produced water, and industry has increasingly switched from fresh water for fracking to use of very saline produced water. And there's a couple of reasons. Initially, the water was too salty and it didn't work with the chemistry that they were using, principally the friction reducers. But better living through chemistry and that sort of thing, industry has now been able to switch from fresh water for their principal source of fracking to produce water. And in the last couple of months, according to the self-reported data, take that for what it's worth, over 80% of the water used for fracking on the New Mexico side of the Permian has been produced water. It's cheap, it's available, it's close, they don't have to haul it as far, and it gives better results. Let's go to next slide.
Hi, Bruce.
So, yes.
Bruce, we're running a little behind, so if you can kind of wrap up so we can move on.
Let's go to the next slide after this. So produced water is the water that is generated with oil, and you can see on the right that the produced water ratio, barrel of oil to barrel of water to barrel of oil, has dropped, but the volume goes up. Next slide, getting to the end. Maybe this might be a good place to stop. The water that has been used for fracking in the Permian side is something on the order of 40,000 acre-feet in 2021. But again, in recent years, that's been principally produced water, not fresh water. You compare that to the total withdrawal, which is close to 400,000 acre-feet. It's a very small fraction, less than 10%. The produced water, that was water for fracking. The produced water is much larger volume. It is on the order of 170,000 acre-feet. The challenge there is disposing of it. So let's go to the I think there's two more slides. One more slide. Yes, one more slide, please. One last more slide. I'm sorry, I apologize. Here's my conclusions. The shortages are subject to multiple disputes, strong connection between oil and gas production. It seems to me the biggest challenge is produced water management. So with that, thank you very much.
Thanks, Bruce, for providing some insights into what's happening in the Permian Basin. And next up, we have Katrina Bennett from Los Alamos, who will look at the potential changes to future availability of water in the decadal timeframe. The floor is yours, Katrina.
Hi, Nicole. Thanks so much. And yeah, thanks for everybody who's attending this workshop. It's great to see so much interest. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about water and climate futures. If you can go to the next slide. So I'll just start a little with sort of the big view of the Earth system. So this image just shows all of the different processes that occur across the climate system, from the subsurface to the air, out to beyond the top of the atmosphere and outer space. So this really is just a figure to show you how much complexity that there is in the Earth system, and all of the different things that we as climate scientists need to think about when we're considering climate changes. So next slide, please. So the climate is changing. So this means that we have rising land and sea surface temperatures. We have changes to timing and the amount of precipitation, and importantly, snow. We have reductions in snow occurring and earlier melt in that snowpack. That results in surface and groundwater declines. We have a hotter air, and so we have increased evapotranspiration. So that's just loss of water to the air and by use from the plants and trees. And so we also have drying soils as a result of this increased temperatures. So that also leads to increases in extreme events, heat waves, wildfire risks, pests, drought, flooding. There's so much that sort of is encompassed in that increased extreme bullet point. And we're already really seeing some of these impacts in the southwest regions of the iWest study area, and that Tom pointed to that as well. So these are things that we're already starting to see emerge in the climate system right now. Next slide, please. So how do we study future climate change? Just a really quick slide to kind of illustrate to you how these changes generally are simulated. So we use these Earth system models. So we model all of those different components that I showed you a couple of slides ago, including the ocean, the land, the air. We think about things like sea ice in the Arctic and Antarctic, glaciers, so ice on land. And then we think all about the interactions across the land surface itself, including hydrology, so water flow, and things like biogeochemistry. And so these models include all of these different components. And so and then we run those simulations using those models, and we extract the changes that we see in temperature and precipitation, and then we use that to drive other models, other simulations that specifically look at the local and regional impacts of that changing temperature and precipitation signal that we see across the Earth's surface. Next slide, please. So these models are getting better and better. So we have a lot more components. You can see in the mid-1970s, we just didn't have very many components in these models. We just really had very simple simulations, but they were still effective. We could still derive conclusions from them and figure out what was happening. But as we progress through time, we've gotten more and more complexity. So when you get to the 2007 box, you can see we have biogeochemistry and interactive vegetation. We're thinking about sea ice interrelationships. So yeah, they're getting better. Next slide, please. They're also getting finer in resolution. So we have improved scales. So we can now represent things like these the Rocky Mountains, for example. Before we just had a lot of that sort of blurred image in the beginning in the early 1990s. We weren't able to represent that topographic change that's so important in terms of estimating, say, changes in snowpack. We need to be able to think about how high the surface is in these simulations. So our resolution has really improved as well. Next slide, please. So what kind of changes do we see? I'm going to talk a little bit about all of these changes. We see increasing temperatures and changing precipitation, and then we see changes in water balance like stream flow, soil snowpack, soil moisture, and evapotranspiration from lakes, reservoirs, plants, and trees. Next slide, please. So increasing temperatures, these figures that I'm going to show in the next few slides are from the NOAA Climate Explorer website, which is a really great tool. You can just go in and plug in your location, and then you get climate simulation results out from this. So here I'm just showing increasing temperatures over time for the sort of upper region of the iWest region, so Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Phoenix, Arizona. And so we're really seeing that strong increase over time. I'm also showing different simulations and different scenarios of change. So we have both higher emission scenarios in the climate system and lower emission scenarios, and those give us slightly different results. So out to 2030 to 2040 to 2070, we're seeing that strong increase in temperatures projected by the models. Next slide, please. So precipitation is a little bit different. There's a lot of variability in our precipitation simulations. So generally what we like to do is look at both the high and low emission scenario. So we can look at what happens when we have increases and decreases in precipitation moving forward. So next slide, please. One thing we do like to look at is different indicators of precipitation. So we look at things like dry days, so the number of days without any precipitation, for example, does show a little bit of variation across the study region. So we see actually a little bit of a wetting signal in Cheyenne, whereas we see a strong drying signal down in Phoenix, which is sort of expected given those wide variations and wide geographical extent of the region. Next slide, please. So we have changing snowpack, as I mentioned. A warming of the atmosphere and the air causes more precipitation to fall as rain during the winter, and this warming also causes an earlier snowpack melt. It also increases the elevation at which snow falls, which is super important in terms of the improved resolution of our climate simulations. There's some complicating factors like dust and snow and albedo effects, but overall we're seeing large declines in snowpack projected for the study area. And I've showed a couple examples on the right-hand side from a recent paper that came out, and just indicating, you know, we are seeing up to 50% decline across the study region in high elevation areas by 2100. Next slide, please. So changing stream flow and groundwater. So we really overall are seeing reduction in stream flow projected to occur largely due to the changes in snow melt, rain falling as snow, and this earlier spring melt. Groundwater declines are also projected. And then there's some complicating factors listed there, along with reservoir operation and retention and water extraction that we're talking about today with regards to energy use. Next slide, please. So changing soil moisture and evapotranspiration, overall, we're seeing increasing drying and aridity. You know, in those scenarios where we use both, you know, increases and decrease in precipitation, we still see aridity going up across the region. And this is because of those increased temperatures, and we have more water being used by plants, trees, and grasses. The water is leaving the reservoirs and lakes and evaporating into the air. And we have more water and energy held in the atmosphere. So overall, sort of this aridity signal across the region. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned earlier, extreme events, you know, are likely to increase over time. So this is about that water and energy in the air speeding up of the hydrological cycle. So more water moving in around and more energy means that we have higher highs and lower lows. We have more precipitation and flooding, high precipitation and flooding, more lows in terms of drought, so low precipitation days and heat waves. And I'm just showing some results from a study that we presented for the Colorado River Basin, showing how all of these different extremes are projected to increase by the 2090s. So yeah, next slide, please. So summary, this is a very, very fast presentation and a pretty high level overview. So you know, questions are more than welcome, even if they're outside this forum. Please get in touch with me. Just to summarize, we're already starting to see the effects of climate change across this study area, and it is really important to consider with regards to mitigation and adaptation to these changes. You know, if we're thinking about water and energy futures, we really need to understand what the climate is, how it's expected to change in the future, so that we can better plan for these expected ranges that we may be seeing. So thanks so much. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Katrina, and thank you to our two other speakers to lead off a great session who provided different facets of the energy water nexus. And now I'll hand it over to Peter, who will guide us through segment 1's Q&A.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you to all the great speakers this morning. I'd like to just tee it off with some general questions and themes that some of the participants submitted when they registered. And to kick it off, and the chat is open as well. If participants have questions now as well, please use the chat function and we'll look to convey those as well and look for themes. So I'd like to start off. One person asked about what are pathways for helping to address challenges related to aquifer recharging. And they're concerned about rainwater harvesting might not be allowed in some states, and just wanted to understand sort of that dynamic. So would anybody like to take that question?
Let me take that. This is Bruce Thompson. Aquifer recharging is a challenge for a number of reasons. First of all, the volumes of water that you can store underground is not really that large, and it requires access to an aquifer. It's also expensive. You've got to treat the water to very high quality before you inject it in the ground so that you don't plug the aquifer, or that the geochemistry of the formation is consistent with the treated water. So in New Mexico, I believe we passed an ASR law about 15 years ago, and maybe it's 20 years ago. And I think there are only 2 projects that have actually been implemented, maybe 3. I think there are 3 projects that have been implemented: aquifer storage and recovery. So there's some technical challenge. There are also some regulatory challenges. The advantage, of course, is that by storing water underground, it doesn't evaporate.
Great, thank you, Professor. And thank you, Katrina, as well, for answering some of the chat links as well. So I appreciate the sort of dynamic aspects of this. Let's see. Question that just came in for Katrina, noted changes in aridity, which will impact water use for agriculture. You also know the shift from snow to rain in the winter. How are these likely to impact water availability for energy? And are these effects going to be seen soon in the next decade or so? Or how long might they take to be felt?
Yeah, that's a great question. Decreased snowpack in the winter is also related to snow actually falling as rain. So I think that's going to vary across the study region. But we are already seeing some of these impacts. We do have kind of rain and snow events. Actually, there's a big event happening right now in Yellowstone. So I think we have started to see some of these. I don't know if I could specifically say sort of when it's going to happen, but I think, you know, these events are projected to increase and have more frequency as we, you know, go through time, sort of starting in the 2030s and then really accelerating by the 2050s. That's really when we start to see the climate scenarios sort of climate impacts, I guess, kick in terms of increases temperatures and then increasing out to the 2070 time frame.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. See, another question that came in from some of the registration participants. What opportunities does New Mexico have to utilize brackish or produced water for hydrogen production? And is this economically viable use of the alternative water resources?
Yeah, I think that actually is going to be covered in a later session. I just would say that treating produced water is very difficult, and I'm somewhat skeptical of the ability to do it. But I believe that's going to be covered in a different session. And I certainly know that one of the moderators, Mike Hightower, has got some knowledge about that. So let's defer that question to him.
Yeah, just quickly. So the requirements set forth by the electrolysis companies are indicating potable water is required. So I agree that the amount of energy and time to produce and clean up brackish water is probably not a viable option.
Thanks for that feedback. Let's see. A question that came in from the chat is the Brackish Groundwater National Desalination Research Facility in New Mexico part of iWest?
I don't know. I was there Friday. I'm working with those folks. Again, this is Bruce Thompson. I don't know if they're part of iWest or not. It's a Bureau of Reclamation facility. Perhaps one of the administrators can address that.
All right, I see another question came in. If the panel could maybe explain why a heavy snowpack replenishes the aquifer better than more abundant rain.
Yeah, I can take that one. Groundwater infiltration is a slow process. So when you have a major rainfall, essentially a very small percentage of that water actually makes it below the soil zone. And once that soil is saturated, you get the runoff. So if it's raining hard, the soil gets saturated, everything above that gets run off. When you have snow that melts, it's a slow process. And so it melts and it infiltrates slowly, and it doesn't ever completely saturate the soil to the point where you get major runoffs like you would in a heavy rainstorm. So it's one of the issues with sort of these future precipitation forecasts is that you can see areas where they're saying, okay, on the average annual rainfall is going to increase, but one of the problems with that, they're going to come in more intense storms. So that actually reduces the amount of flow that you would or the amount of infiltration you would get into an aquifer.
Great, thank you, Tom. Great answer. Another one from the segment one questions here. What are some examples of opportunities, technologies, companies, et cetera, that combine water conservation, such as water recycling, with energy transition? It's open to the floor.
One of the really big ones is over the use of wastewater, treated municipal wastewater for cooling at the Palo Verde nuclear power plant. So that's a great example. The challenge is that the city of Phoenix realizes the value of the water, and they would like to use it for reuse. So, you know, it's another one of these conflicts between alternative uses. So that's an obvious one I can think of.
Yeah, and just to add to that a little bit, Bruce, Palo Verde has actually said that if they cannot properly restructure their contracts, that they might actually have to shut down by 2035. So this water competition for this water is serious, and you know, I think somebody in the chat said, you know, or maybe it was Bruce, said that water flows to money, right? And so that's a situation there where the city of Phoenix can sell the water at a higher price to, say, golf courses and things like that than they can to Palo Verde.
Great, thank you. I see in the chat that looked like somebody mentioned Christina Cully. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your name correctly. Had your hand raised. If you're able to unmute, we'd love to hear your question.
Hi, I actually didn't have a question. I just had an answer. Somebody had asked about ASR projects, and I'm familiar with an ASR project in New Mexico mostly. We've successfully used it in 3 projects here in the state of New Mexico. There was an ASR Act passed under the New Mexico Water Code about 15 to 18 years ago. Perhaps the most successful story of it was part of the Albuquerque drinking water project. And Albuquerque has done a really fantastic job in restoring groundwater levels in the Middle Rio Grande by utilizing ASR and also by utilizing their San Juan Chama project water for drinking water in conjunction with lowering withdrawals of groundwater during certain periods. And so it's been a real success. As Bruce mentioned, it's not a simple process, but if you can figure it out, it can have major positive impacts in certain basins.
Great. Thank you so much. Great answer. Let's see, we have just a few more minutes until we'll pivot to the next session. One question from one of the registration participants. Maybe some of the panel could speak more to this. I think there's a question in here. It'd be great to also see a little bit more data on the industrial water and emissions, how they play a role in the total data for energy, water, and emissions coming from the water, wastewater interplay. And also how agriculture plays in this energy water nexus. Maybe somebody can expand upon their previous discussion points.
So I can speak a little bit to the agriculture. So I mean, I guess I'm wondering like how to put this a little more into context. I mean, from a consumptive point of view, agriculture is the biggest water user that we have. About half the water they use is from groundwater. And we're seeing many parts of the West and the Midwest where groundwater is becoming scarce. And there's going to be issues that we need to offset some of that groundwater use with surface water so if we're going to maintain the same production. So the good news is, you know, there is room for improving efficiencies, you know, changing crop types and things like that to help reduce water consumption. Also, irrigation methods can help a lot also, but it's something to be concerned about. The other side about agriculture is that it will be able to move a little bit with the climate. So part of the forecast is, you know, you have the breadbasket of the U.S., but that'll move further north into Canada, and so Canada could start to become a higher producer of agricultural products also.
Thank you, Tom. All right, let's see. For the benefit of keeping on time, we're at time for the next session to start. So thank you all for your questions and the panel for the great answers and great presentations. I encourage any participants to please put your questions in the chat, as I was mentioned before this is recorded, and we can look to get back to you at a later time. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much. So we're now going to make a start with segment 2, and we're going to talk about water needs and energy transition in the I-West region. So this segment will also be about 45 minutes, and it will, just as a friendly reminder, it will be followed by a short break. So the moderators of this segment 2 are Janie Chermak, and she is a professor of economics at University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, and myself, and I am a science manager at Los Alamos National Lab. Next slide, please. So this segment 2 consists of 5 lightning talks, and these are very short talks that basically give us a tour of the water needs for different energy technologies in the Intermountain West region. And we're going to follow these 5 lightning talks by a roundtable discussion. I'd like to invite you to put your questions and comments in the chat, and we're going to go to the chat as soon as the roundtable discussion starts. So following this segment 2, we'll have a short break, and segment 3 then will start at around 10:50 a.m. Mountain Time. Next slide, please. So the picture here towards the left shows the CO2 emissions in the Intermountain West region in the past 20 years. So the vertical axis shows CO2 emissions in million metric tons, and the horizontal axis shows the year. And as you can see, these emissions, they vary a little bit from year to year, dependent on different factors. But more importantly, these CO2 emissions, they are coming from a whole range of CO2 sectors. And those are shown in the map towards the right. So the map towards the right shows the 6 states of the Intermountain West region with colored circles. And these colored circles, they indicate the CO2 sector that is responsible for the CO2 emissions. And the size of the circles indicates how much, the volume of the CO2 emissions per location. And as you can see from the map towards the right, these CO2 emissions come from many different emission sources. For example, the lightest blue colors show agriculture and food manufacturing. The red colors show electricity generation. The purple colors show petroleum refineries and pulp and paperboard and sawmills. So in order to reduce the CO2 emissions in the Intermountain West region, and reach a net zero emission state, we need to look at this entire field of CO2 emission sources. Next slide, please. So in the Intermountain West, these reductions in CO2 emissions can come from different sources. So towards the right of this slide, you can see the potential technology pathways. For example, in the brown color is indicated land management, and you can imagine that changes in land management in this area may help to reduce net CO2 emissions. The darker blue colors indicate changes in transportation. For example, low carbon transportation in terms of electric vehicles may contribute to a reduction in CO2 emissions. Well, in this segment, we're going to address several of these potential technology pathways. We're going to look at low carbon electricity. We're going to look at CO2 storage, underground storage. We're going to look at direct air capture and point source capture of CO2. We're going to look at hydrogen production, and we're going to look at biofuels. Next slide, please. So from this story, it is hopefully clear that CO2 reductions in the Intermountain West region, this is a very complex process that connects many different energy economies, and that is shown schematically here in the figure towards the left. So the figure towards the left shows a tetrahedron of symbiotic energy economies that will all be involved and are connected to each other in technology pathways towards carbon reduction in the Intermountain West region. Next slide, please. So we're going to now make a start with the lightning talks in segment 2, and I'm going to hand this over to my co-moderator, Janie Chermak. Janie.
Thank you very much. We have a group of 5 speakers who will each give a lightning talk. And basically 5 minutes or less, and I'll try to keep us on that so we have plenty of time for questions. I would suggest that everybody look at the bios of these folks because they are a very talented group. And we're going to start with Dr. Mary Ewers, who is at Los Alamos, and she's going to talk about low carbon electricity and the water uses thereof. So Mary, it's your time. Thanks.
Thank you, Janie, and thank you everyone for being here. My name is Mary Ewers. I'm from Los Alamos National Laboratory, and I'm going to be talking about water usage for electricity in the I-West region. At the most basic level, down in the lower left-hand corner, fuel goes into an electric power plant. It's ignited, it turns into heat, it turns a turbine, and creates electricity. But not all of the heat is turned into electricity, and there's a lot of heat that escapes the system. And that heat needs to be dissipated into the atmosphere through a cooling system. Well, water is what we use to cool most of our electric power plants. The more efficient plants need less cooling. That's an important thing to remember. All the data that is in this presentation comes from the 2020 thermoelectric cooling water data from the EIA, available at the link down there below. And then on the right-hand side, we have a map of the I-West region, and this is depicting all of the thermoelectric power plants that use water for their cooling systems. The size of the circle indicates how much water they withdraw in 2020, how much water was withdrawn for the year of 2020 and used for cooling. And then also, they're also labeled with the water source, either surface, groundwater, or discharge water. So for example, up in the north, in Montana, all the thermoelectric power plants are cooled with surface water. Wyoming, we also have an abundance of surface water in Wyoming, and so their thermoelectric power plants are cooled with surface water. Utah also has a majority of surface water cooling their power plants. When we get to Colorado, we've got surface water, groundwater, and discharge water. And when I say discharge, I mean a discharge from a municipal water treatment plant or sewage treatment plant or some other reclaimed water source. And then as we get down to the southern states where water is less abundant, we have mostly groundwater is cooling our power plants there, except for in the Four Corners area here, we use surface water in the Four Corners power plant. And again, in Arizona, mostly groundwater, except we've got our nuclear power plant, as has been said already. Palo Verde uses the discharge water from the Phoenix sewage effluent. Next slide, please. So how is this water used in these different plant technologies? Well, here's the breakdown in this pie chart over here. We've got the coal for the year 2020. Coal withdrew, and these are withdrawal amounts. These are not consumption amounts. Coal withdrew 248 billion gallons, and they use the most. So coal uses the most water to produce electricity in the I-West region. And then we have followed by natural gas, which withdrew 90 billion gallons in 2020. And then our sole nuclear power plant, Palo Verde, withdrew 23 billion gallons of water. And we have different types of cooling technologies. So we've got the recirculate induced draft. This is where you have towers with fans on top that are pulling the heat up through a tower, and it's being cooled with water. Recirculation, and then the water is recirculated. And so the recirculation technology uses less withdrawals. And so that's a technology that is widely used. You can also have you recirculate with a cooling pond, same technology. And then we do have a few plants, not very many, that use the once-through technology for cooling. And so the once-through technology, it withdraws water from either a river or a water body, cools the generator, and then it's discharged back into the river or the water body. And so the once-through technology withdraws a great amount of water. And so there are not very many of those left. And then we also have dry cooling technologies. Wyoming does have a few plants that have dry cooling technology. And this is more like the radiator in your car. You know, the heat is pulled into a heat exchanger and the outside air cools it. Dry cooling works well in the colder climates. It's not as efficient in the warmer, hotter climates. So how much water is currently used? Over here in this panel, we've got the total generation in the I-West region in 2020. Total generation megawatt hours from coal, natural gas, and nuclear. You can see coal has the lion's share of the generation, and so it makes sense they have the lion's share of the water withdrawal as well. We have water withdrawals in million gallons, water consumption in million gallons, and again, consumption is the water. I think Bruce already defined this, but it's the amount of water that is consumed and it's not returned back into the atmosphere or back to the water source. And then we have I have water withdrawal intensity rates over here and consumption intensity rates. So withdrawal intensity rates, coal is the largest with 2,080 gallons per megawatt hour produced, natural gas 1162 per megawatt hour produced, and nuclear, Palo Verde withdraws 692 gallons per megawatt hour produced. Consumption intensity, of course, is less. Coal is 448 gallons per megawatt hour produced, natural gas 249 gallons, and then nuclear, the EIA, again, it's the exact same amount as withdrawal. They do not return water to their sewage plant. So how could freshwater needs be lowered? Well, we can use
Mary, Mary, just we're running out of time, so.
Oh, sure. Use reclaimed water, discharge water, brackish, saline, switch to dry cooling, increasing efficiency of the power plant. Now, deploying these technologies at large scale, we need more research to figure out how much water would be used, say, in blending natural gas and hydrogen. We know that hydrogen takes water to produce. And so we need to figure out if that'll increase our water usage or decrease depending on the efficiencies of the power plants. Nuclear with small modular reactors will use probably about the same amount of water that traditional nuclear reactors use. And then there's also deploying carbon capture technology on fossil fuel plants. That will, you'll hear more about that in the next few lightning talks. And thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I would also say, remember to write your questions in the chat. We will have time afterwards. And so I would now like to turn this over to Dr. Troy Semmelsberger from Los Alamos National Labs. And he is going to focus on low carbon hydrogen in water. Troy?
Thank you, Janie. Yes, Troy Semmelsberger, and I'm going to go over the water usage for two types of hydrogen that have been highlighted to be the savior with the hydrogen economy, and those two are blue and green hydrogen. So let's get into it. Next slide. So we have to make sure we point out that this is a time where water and energy can no longer be discussed independently of each other, which is why this workshop is taking place. Water is a global commodity touching every industry and every living thing on the planet. And quite frankly, it's a necessity. So, and this workshop highlights the importance of the water management and the transition from fossil to renewable energy. But given that the I-West region is water limited, water management is perhaps the biggest hurdle to the decarbonization of the region that we face. The biggest hurdle being public perception and its socioeconomic impacts. Prior to our analyses, I, like many others, were convinced that water in the I-West was the nail in the coffin for our decarbonization strategy. But it turns out that this really isn't the case. So currently, steam methane reforming produces 95% of the global hydrogen demand, with the majority being used for the oil and gas industry. Using SMR to supply pure hydrogen for all of the fuel cell electric vehicles in the I-West, so if we were to replace every ICE engine with a fuel cell electric vehicle, would require extensive infrastructure, distribution, and storage build-outs. However, the biggest challenge, again, is the public perception of using water in a water-limited region as a source of hydrogen. And according to our analyses, the amount of water required to supply enough blue hydrogen for every fuel cell electric vehicle in the I-West region equates to only around 0.3 million acre feet per year. And when you compare that to the water usage in the I-West for, say, agriculture, which tops out at about 45 million acre feet per year, or 3.6 million acre feet per year for public water usage, really the amount of water usage for hydrogen is very small. In fact, this is on par with
Something was off.
So all I would have to do is Google it, like water conservation or something.
Yeah, so they will.
I'm sorry, is someone asking a question?
No, I think somebody was just unmuted. Please continue.
Oh, okay. Well, okay. So this is actually on par with the amount of water usage for the current thermoelectric power generation in the I-West region, and that's around 0.4 million acre feet per year. So in a nutshell, the amount of water needed for blue hydrogen is really not a showstopper. And actually, you know, it's quite advantageous when you start looking at all the other numbers surrounding blue hydrogen. Strategies to lessen the water usage. I think Bruce and Mary have pointed out that you want to use produced or brackish water as much as possible. But I do think that water purification and desalination are also critical technologies that should be exploited to take advantage of the water produced, because you're not going to use brackish or brine water as a source of water for steam methane reforming. So it's still important to look at, but I don't think it's a necessary requirement to reduce the amount of water used for blue hydrogen. By transitioning from coal-fired power plants to natural gas-fired power plants, we can decrease our water usage by a step change of 33%. And also accompanying that is a reduction of CO2 emissions by 56%. Slide 3. Hydrogen can also be produced from water electrolysis, where the electricity used is generated via solar or wind, and that's shown in the upper left quadrant. Water in this case is the sole source of hydrogen and is referred to as green hydrogen. Similar to blue hydrogen, the perception of using water as a source of green hydrogen is really off-putting, especially when you're competing against the ag industry and the public water supply. If we were to replace all of the I-West vehicles, not unlike the previous slide of the IC engines, with fuel cell electric vehicles, our analysis indicates a further decrease in the amount of water required, equating to about 0.09 million acre feet per year. And that's actually 70% less than the water required for blue hydrogen. So in essence, you know, we're actually, by transitioning to green and blue hydrogen, we're actually saving water. So it's more of a water conservation. Similar to blue hydrogen, water recycling, purification, and reuse are all strategies to decrease freshwater withdrawals, thus further minimizing the impacts on the existing water usage. In a nutshell, the take-home message is that blue and green hydrogen are expected to have minimal impact on the overall water usage in the region. And I would be as bold to say, in fact, that blue and green hydrogen are likely to have a positive impact on the overall water availability and resource management in the region. So that concludes my talk.
Troy, thank you very much. Mary, thank you as well. Continuing on, we're going to move to carbon capture, and this will be Dr. Jim Gadiger from Los Alamos National Labs. And Jim, take it away, please.
Thanks, Janie. We're talking about point source capture in this lightning talk, and the map that we're showing here is the map of point source emissions. There are also distributed emissions that aren't part of this map, but this shows all the point sources, and what that means is concentrated emissions of CO2. And the classic example is a flue gas stream from burning fossil fuels, either for electricity generation or industrial heat production. In the I-West, the scale of these various circles on this map are limited in their size, but by far electricity generation from fossil fuels dominates the point sources. And so the electricity generation flue gas streams is certainly a good image to keep in mind here. And on the next slide, it's what I'll primarily talk about here because it really does represent the majority of point source emissions and the most technologically mature demonstrated capture scenario. But point source capture is a mature technology pathway, especially in that case of electricity generation, to reducing CO2 emissions in the near term and through the long term. And it's been demonstrated at a large scale operationally. And principally, just like the power plants themselves, the water consumption is for evaporative cooling. And in flue gas CO2 separation and capture, that is taking the flue gas stream, separating out and capturing the CO2 for further sequestration. The flue gas stream is cooled to the ideal process temperature range, and then the CO2 industrial process itself heats and cools typically, and there are a number of different technologies being researched, but the one that's most available today will be heating and cooling a solvent to capture and release that CO2. The inset picture there shows in the center of the picture what a carbon capture industrial facility looks like in the context of a coal plant in that case, including the cooling associated with that point source capture. So what does water use look like at full scale? This is largely looking forward at the analysis, so we can take a generous estimate of point source emissions amenable to capture by point source capture. And that means that some electricity generation will be too small at this point in terms of their output to make this an economically viable proposition. Other industrial processes that do consume a lot of fossil fuels to generate heat can be considered for point source capture, but not all are technologically mature, not all industrial processes. So we might say that it's around 200 million tons per year of the total emissions of the region, requiring around 200. So taking a generous estimate for the purposes of thinking about water use, requiring around 200,000 acre feet per year of evaporative cooling, which is about 2/3 of today's fossil electricity generation water use. How much water is currently used? Point source capture is not currently operationally deployed anywhere in the I-West, although there are pilot scale projects operating and at scale planning for deployment. The projection is something like I spoke of just earlier. How could water use needs be lowered? Again, this is primarily thinking about cooling. And so adoption of dry cooling systems reduces the point source capture water use and consumption by 90%. The remainder of that would be process use and using the current technology, which again, there's a number of technologies coming online for this with different numbers in the detail, but that's a good one to keep in mind for what might be deployed currently. We could lower this also by, in general, with the rest of the cooling kind of discussion using reclaimed, discharged, or produced water. And in summary, cooling needs are similar scale to electricity generation, and water use can be avoided. So from a perspective of water use, water use is not something that potentially probably should be thought of as something that holds up point source capture adoption. And that's me. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Jim. We're going to move now to kind of the secondary part of this, which is carbon capture and utilization. And Dr. Derek Bacara from the National Energy Technology Laboratories will do this presentation. Derek, the floor is yours.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. Yeah, my name is Derek Bacara. I'm a support contractor with the National Energy Technology Laboratory in Pittsburgh, PA. And my talk is going to focus largely on a potential opportunity for generating new water sources as part of CO2 storage operations, particularly in regards to storing CO2 in saline-bearing formations. So next slide, please. And so here we're talking about carbon capture and storage, or CCS, which involves injecting captured CO2 into suitable subsurface geologic reservoirs for long-term storage. And the process is intended to keep CO2 stored underground instead of it being emitted directly to the atmosphere. And the technology, it has huge decarbonization potential, but injection into the subsurface can pose potential risks, and one of those being increased pressure in the subsurface. So how much water is actually used in this technology? Water protection and preservation is actually key to conducting CO2 storage operations. Water is not necessarily used in the storage aspect of CCS. However, operators are tasked with protecting underground sources of drinking water as part of their operations. And so natural storage systems must have certain geologic attributes that ensure containment exists that enable groundwater to be protected over the life of a storage project. Operators can choose to employ water production strategies from storage operations or from storage formations as depicted in the schematic up in the top left, which serves to manage and reduce pressure in the subsurface and even improve storage capacity. The process involves producing fluid from the storage formation from a production well away from injection. And this type of approach can also be used to support sort of steering of the plume in the subsurface, which helps meeting conformance expectations. And then the engineered components of a storage system like wells, as shown in the figure to the right there, have to have safeguards like casing and cementing to prevent rapid movement of fluids out of the storage formation into a potential drinking water source. So how much water is currently used? The water usage in the storage component of CCS, as mentioned, is exceedingly small compared to other low carbon technologies. In the I-West, there's a little over 40 CCS projects in operation or planned. Most of them are EOR related or acid gas injection related, occurring at various sizes. They're operating on scales from tens of thousands of tons a year to upwards of millions of tons per year planned. And so some examples of projects in the region that are emerging are shown in the top right. They give a sense of scale for large scale capture and storage development potential in the region and what that might mean in terms of water. These two examples are from DOE supported Carbon Safe Initiative. One's related to the Dry Fork Station in Wyoming and the other is the San Juan Generating Station in New Mexico. And these projects are planning to operate on scales of several million tons a year of CO2 captured and stored. And are also considering the option of producing and managing water as part of the reservoir management strategies. So what would it look like at full scale? The challenge here is that produced water ultimately needs managed, either via treatment or reuse, or redisposed back in the subsurface through deep well disposal. Treatment for reuse is a must because native waters contain several constituents, including high levels of dissolved solids or TDS, which need reduced before they can actually be reused. Treatment and reuse provides an opportunity and a potential benefit to the region in terms of generating new water sources, but also certain treatment approaches can offer benefits related to resource recovery from waters themselves, and that includes potential low-grade geothermal energy, potential rare earth element extraction, to name a few, largely also based on the constituency of the water being produced. So the schematic here in the bottom left sort of shows a high-level volume per volume analysis of CO2 storage operation that produces water for pressure management to get a sense of scale on what we're talking about, and then the potential perspectives for use following treatment or disposal. And so assuming 100 million tons a year, that would produce an equivalent of roughly 364 million barrels of water. That's about 110,000 acre feet per year on a volume-to-volume basis. So that level of deployment would equate to roughly half of the abatement of the I-West 45Q eligible point source fleet, provide water to volume roughly a third of the regional power usage rate, 40% of the industrial water usage rate, but barely make a dent in the regional irrigation water supply. So while the scale of water handling seems enormous here, the produced volume of CO2 storage, assuming this case, is really relatively minimal compared to other regional water uses. And so finally, how can water needs be lowered? And this is a bit different because of the opportunity case. So overall, the treatment and reuse concept that we sort of discussed can augment the regional water supply. It can support more effective CO2 storage operations and limit deep well disposal, which has its own implications. And deep well disposal is often the cheapest water management strategy, and treatment, as we've heard in other talks, comes with costs, energy use, and potential scale challenges. Based on this chart here in the left, we can see that the TDS levels in I-West geologic formations is highly varied, and it can get pretty high in certain instances. And those higher concentrations of TDS equates typically to more intensive treatment and associated costs. And you can sort of see that in the scale on the right. You can see sort of a trend with the higher TDS level in the influent, the more intensive and more costly treatment that's associated. Well, I'm sure you can't read what each of those little treatment things mean. And finally, those blue lines on the chart at the right show where some key thresholds exist related to water cutoffs within the I-West. So you can see the TDS cutoff where EPA defines a drinking water source at 10,000 parts per million. You can see where seawater typically ranges from, and then you can see where the range of I-West TDS ranges have shown to be for subsurface reservoirs, which is highly varied.
And Derek, can we wrap it up in 30 seconds or so?
That's it. I appreciate the hook, Janie. I'm done anyway. That was my last talking point. Appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Perfect. Thank you so much. Last, we have Dr. Babetta Peroni. Babs is from Los Alamos National Labs, and she is going to focus on bioenergy. And Babs, before you start, I will say I'm having internet connection problems. So Yolanta, if I disappear, I will try to get back on, but please take over if I don't. So Babs, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Janie. Hello, I'm Babs Maroney. I'm a bioscientist here at Los Alamos, representing the bioenergy and water part of this workshop today. And I'd also like to acknowledge my colleague, Kurt Solander, a hydrologist and Earth system modeler. Next slide, please. So bioenergy, that is power or fuels from biomass, can play an important role as a low carbon source for our energy needs. However, the needs for water for bioenergy are important to consider. There are a range of options for feedstocks used for bioenergy, and each feedstock has its own water footprint. The so-called first generation feedstocks, such as corn, are food crops and directly compete with food production for natural resources, including fresh water. Second generation feedstocks are crop residues such as corn stover or other waste biomass or carbon sources that can be converted into energy, but their water footprint in general is lower than the first generation feedstocks. And then finally, the third generation feedstocks, typically microalgae, can have a large water footprint, but are also more tolerant of poor water quality, which is an advantage. Water is used to produce these feedstocks and also to process them into energy or fuel precursor molecules. In the upper right, the I-West region, compared to other regions of the country, is not a big producer of bioenergy. We only have 5 ethanol biorefineries in the I-West that I was able to find, a few commercial algae growers, but we have several anaerobic digestion facilities that convert wastewater or dairy or hog farms that convert organic carbon to a biogas. 1 liter of biofuel consumes 39 to 642 liters of water. That's an exact number. The large range is based on the type of feedstock, that is first, second, or third generation, as well as the location. But the renewable natural gas area is really growing fast right now. According to Biofuels Digest, which is a trade organization, the renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel, renewable natural gas like the biogas, cellulosic ethanol, renewable chemicals, biomaterials, novel crops, and waste feedstocks are all sectors that are really in a boom phase right now in the advanced bioeconomy in an effort to decarbonize and meet net zero goals. In the lower left, the water footprint of biofuels has been under study for the past decade or more by the national labs, supported by the Bioenergy Technologies Office of DOE. In particular, how the need for water in bioenergy and biofuel production will change with a changing climate and water stress. For example, colleagues at Argonne National Laboratory near Chicago have developed a useful tool for analysis of the water resource needs for bioenergy called Water, And this is just one example of the tools that are out there to look at the water resources required for bioenergy. In the lower right, so if bioenergy were to grow in the I-West region, there are several options for reducing its water footprint. First, we could reduce dependence on first-generation feedstocks and increase our use of alternative biomass feedstocks and waste, which is an important area of study right now. Second, the I-West does have quite a bit of forest resources, which do not compete for fresh water. And in the bioenergy part of the I-West portfolio, we're studying the impact that selective use of a portion of these forest resources, particularly dead trees from fire, drought, or other disturbances, could make to the decarbonization and clean energy goals of I-West. Third, the I-West, because of dependence on the fossil fuel industry, does have an abundance of produced waters, which you've heard other speakers speak about today. Some of the poorest quality water, produced waters, could be repurposed for algae cultivation, particularly in the Permian Basin, which could contribute to the biofuel economy. Other of the better quality produced waters with lower total dissolved solids, for example, in the San Juan Basin and in the rest of the I-West, could be used perhaps with some pretreatment for agriculture, even for bioenergy crops, the use of other food crop residues as a biomass source for energy production, or for horticulture. And finally, microalgae is an excellent way to clean up municipal wastewater for reuse. Companies like Clearas in Montana are growing. The algae can then be harvested periodically and used as a biofuel or bioproduct feedstock. And this is being done to turn that algae that's been used to clean up wastewater into a so-called living ink, or to produce sort of a bioplastics material that can be used as a component in a product. So Kurt and others on our team will be analyzing these options and more in the bioenergy part of the I-West technology roadmap. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Babs. So we've had a really good, I think, overview of a number of different aspects of water and different energy uses. There's a tremendous number of questions in the chat, but I think I'll kick it off with just asking the group that if you think about the water use for these different technologies, and you think about the types of water we have and the cleanliness that will be needed for each of these, you know, is it possible, especially in the case of cooling, you know, can we use poor quality water? Can we use brine? Is that going to be cost prohibitive? And if you were to think about these different technologies in a hierarchy, where might we be able to best match, I would say, lower quality water to the energy use? And I'll just open that up to the group, and then Jolanta will come back and monitor some of the chat questions. Anyone?
I think none of us probably want to take a deep dive into the cooling technology area.
Well, there you go. I guess, you know.
But I do know that one thing is that it makes the proposition more expensive, as you have to use materials that are subject to corrosion. If you want to use particularly saline water, but water with other contaminants as well. So in many of these questions, it's a cost proposition. And you'd have to look more closely in any particular case at where the trade-offs are between the economics and the outcome you're looking at.
Yeah, and so Jim, I would assume that it perhaps comes down to the fact that it's going to be a very localized decision because of the fact of the quality of water that would be at a specific place, coupled with the type of energy that we might be looking at.
Yes, thank you. And the certainly different wells produce different types of water, right? So it is something that would have to be customized and looked into on a case-by-case basis to some degree.
All right. Hey, Jolanta, do you want to bring up some of the chat questions?
Absolutely. Oh, also, some people had submitted questions when they registered for the workshop. So I'm going to first start with a question from that list. And that is the following question. So I think this question is for Troy. How much water does hydrogen production and CCUS use compared to conventional power generation plants?
I'm sorry, read that question again. I was actually typing another question, so.
I understand. So how much water, so how is the water usage for hydrogen production and CCUS? How does that compare to conventional power generation plants?
Are you talking conventional like coal?
Correct. What we have today.
I don't actually have that number right on at the tip of my tongue, but I know if you're to replace the coal powered plants with, say, natural gas, you'd reduce that water consumption by 33%. And I'd have to dig up those numbers. But for example, I was just talking with Prashant and the team because I was looking for additional numbers. Blue hydrogen without natural gas extraction is around 0.25 million acre feet per year. And if you were just to do steam methane reforming without carbon capture or in the analysis excluding the natural gas extraction portion, requires only around 0.08 million acre feet per year. And keep in mind that green hydrogen is estimated to use about 0.09 million acre feet of water.
Thanks, Troy. I also have a follow-up question on this from the chat. So what types of water, produced water, brackish water, fresh water, what types of water can be used to produce hydrogen?
Yeah, so whenever you use water as a reactant, certainly in steam methane reforming where you have a catalytic reaction, you want to make sure that the purity is pretty high because you don't want to start deactivating your catalyst. You also start having buildup of deposits due to fouling that impact the heat transfer. So you want it as strict as possible and the highest quality to maintain durability and reduce your OpEx cost in the future. And I'm assuming, and I know every catalyst manufacturer has their requirements for whatever their catalyst was designed for their feedstocks. Methane is another one that you have to actually remove the sulfur before you actually use it in steam methane reforming. It's known as hydrodesulfurization because sulfur is a known catalyst poison. So there's already some cleanup and scrubbing that occur in steam methane reforming, but I don't know the total dissolved solids that are required for the water. I suspect that you were going to foul up your boiler immediately if you start using brackish water or brine water because you're going to be depositing salts and those solids immediately.
Thanks. Thanks, Troy. The next questions are for Derek Vaquera. So Derek, one question is the capacity of subsurface storage for carbon a concern in the Intermountain West region?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I was able to give a quick response in the chat, and largely to summarize is initial assessments of storage capacity in the iWest region seem very positive. The initial work done by the regional carbon sequestration partnerships, as published in DOE's Carbon Storage Atlas, show that there's hundreds to even potentially thousands of years of storage capacity in the geologic formations in the iWest. And so as projects move towards sort of screening reservoir prospects for storage into actually identifying sites and qualifying that storage, they'll get a better sense on how certain those capacity estimates are. But the initial take is that it does seem very positive to accommodate the emissions that currently exist. If those emission sources are augmented with new sources that emerge like blue hydrogen or even DAC. So the outlook so far is so good on the capacity side.
Great, thanks. And a follow-up question, is induced seismicity a concern with subsurface carbon storage?
Yeah, there were some really good questions there, and I was anxious to start typing to those. But yes, absolutely. I think the analog that has been shown with deep well waste disposal from the oil and gas sector, where Oklahoma, I think, is the is the hotbed of activity that has correlated injection operations with induced seismic events, has prompted that is a major research thrust for CO2 storage. And so DOE has and is currently investing a substantial portion of its research dollars on exploring the cause and effect of ways to understand what is causing induced seismicity, how to prevent it, ways to characterize sites so that you can look for precursors that might cause that, so that you can pick the right sites and operate them effectively. From a produced water perspective, that pressure alleviation should essentially help. I think the increased reservoir pressure is a trigger to cause those seismic that seismic activity, either felt or unfelt. And so alleviating via pressure management will help, but we will get ourselves in the same dynamic if you're just intending to potentially re-inject that produced water into another formation that could then maybe pressure up that formation. So so that treatment opportunity really starts to rise to the top there as a way to help that pressure management and also alleviate or kick the can down the road for a potential other induced seismicity problem just by re-injecting it elsewhere.
Great, thanks so much. Jenny, we have time for one more quick question before we go to the break.
Okay, I guess, my question, I'm gonna take the floor and ask a question, is that I keep thinking back to this quote about, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. And I think it, fits here as well as anything because of the fact that we're looking at so many differences in terms of the availability of water, the understanding of the use of water, and the potential or lack thereof potential harm going forward. So if you're to start to thinking about this from more of the kind of place-based solutions, knowing that I think in the West, there are a lot of communities that are very skeptical of changes in how we use water and what we do with energy, as a group of scientists, what would be the takeaway that you would want to provide to communities to say, these are the things to think about, these are the pros and these are the cons, these are the good things, but here's what we still need to be interested in. And I know that's a very broad-based question, but if nobody starts talking in the next 10 seconds, I'll call on someone. Babs, how about you? I'll call on you.
Janie, I always have an opinion. So I
know.
I guess a message would be that there are so many options now for water, even water cleanup and reuse, reclamation from various processes, that to not let water be a deterrent to clean energy and advancing clean energy options. Yes, it's going to be used just like water is used now in oil and gas extraction and in the coal industry. So it's part of energy, all parts of energy, and clean energy is not going to be any different there. But I think right now we have the technology and the knowledge to be able to make better use of the dwindling water resources that we do have. Try to avoid fresh water to the extent we can. Try to make cleaner water where the technology allows. But don't let water deal with the water problem. Don't let water be the enemy of clean energy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that answer. So we're now going to have a 6 minutes break. So 10 to 11 Mountain Time, 10 to the top of the hour, we will be back with segment number 3. Welcome back, everyone, after the break to the third and last segment of this workshop. Mike, are you here?
Yes, I am.
Great. Moderators for segment 3, are you here?
Yes, we are.
Fantastic.
Yes,
Then
we are.
let's move on. I'm going to hand it to you for the third segment of this workshop. And this segment is followed by an open mic. Take it away.
Great, thank you, everybody. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Mike Hightower. Many of you know Mike. He's the program director of the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium, a joint effort by the New Mexico Environment Department and New Mexico State University. He worked at Sandia National Laboratories for 38 years and has a bachelor's and master's degrees in civil and environmental engineering from New Mexico State University. So with that, Mike, please take it away.
Peter, how you been? Long time no see.
I'm great, my friend.
Okay, guys, I was asked to just give a short presentation on some of the opportunities to use non-traditional resources, water resources for energy transitions in the West. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So Peter, you're just going to move the slides for me? Does that make it easier?
I think somebody else does if you say page forward.
Okay, let's just go next slide. I just want to show one of the reasons that produced water is getting some national attention. It is one of the 5 major categories of industrial wastewater reuse identified in the National Water Reuse Action Plan by the EPA in 2020. And a lot of people go, you know, why produced water? It's not that ubiquitous. It's only in a few states. But in reality, if you look at on the left figure there, the states that are all blue are states that are showing at least regional water stress or local water stress over the course in this decade in 2020. So we're seeing a lot of states that are showing major water stresses statewide or regionally or locally. And I think that's a point we need to bring out is when we look at water planning for the West, if we look at gross numbers as far as water availability, they look like these uses of water for energy are pretty small. But since they're all localized, there's a lot of local communities, regional community that have really huge issues around existing water supplies. So I think we need to look at this as a regional perspective since these are going to be distributed systems. And we've got to look at those local water issues. The second middle slide there just shows a study done by Argonne about a decade ago, just mentioning the types and numbers of power plants that were having issues with water availability. So those are where existing power plants are. A lot of people want to transition those power plants to other types of fuels, from coal and natural gas to hydrogen. So maybe some of those plants will likely be used as for transition. And you can see that on the right-hand side, the view graph that shows where there are the shale resources for the United States, that a lot of eastern states have water stress and have current power plants that are short of water, and the fact that produced water is developed there actually gives you an opportunity to look at the infrastructure where you've got carbon capture sequestration opportunities, oil and gas pipeline opportunities that already exist, and the ability to use that produced water then makes produced water something that is more viable across the country, and why it was listed as one of the 5 major topic areas for interest in the Water Reuse Action Plan by the EPA. So next slide. So with that, let me just talk about maybe some of the western states, and I'm going to use New Mexico as an example. There's a lot of non-traditional water resources in the state of New Mexico. There are in Arizona, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming. And some of the numbers that we get are quite large, but in reality, a lot of these brackish aquifers are relatively deep, and therefore it's not that economical to get access to a lot of those brackish waters. So I show here in New Mexico huge estimates of water, brackish water availability, but what's easily available or economically viable and could be treated is probably a lot less than that. But if you look at our current water consumption in the state of New Mexico, it's still a large supply of water that could be utilized. One of the biggest issues we have with the brackish waters is that most of the resources are not well characterized. We don't have a lot of infrastructure there, and it's going to take years of assessment to get access to those kind of brackish water resources, and a lot of infrastructure to put into place, which then suggests that my next slide that talks about produced water resources. So if you can go to the next slide for me. What we have are places where we have a lot of infrastructure in place. So this is just shows the cost of desalination for any of the uses for energy. I think you're going to have to look at pretty high quality water. If you want to do steam reforming and natural gas, it's going to have to be at a steam quality, which is on the order of tens to hundreds of low hundreds of parts per million TDS. If you want to do electrolysis, it's got to be essentially distilled water. That's very high quality. And so if you look at the costs of these non-traditional water resources, they're beginning to get to be at par, at least on the brackish side, of new supplies of fresh water. So we're seeing that the cost of the marginal cost of water, as Peter used to say, Peter Ccos, they're about the same. The cost for some of the produced waters that are much higher in TDS, oftentimes in the 100,000 parts per million range, are significantly higher in costs. But the avoided costs of disposal for produced water is also very high. And so what we're seeing is, because of produced water being often available, we understand the quantities, we have the infrastructure in place, the disposal wells in place to handle the concentrate, ways to handle EOR, so carbon disposal, makes produced water maybe more attractive than saline water because it's more easily available. We know where it's at, and you have avoided costs that you can address. So I think my last slide here is a lot of people complain, worry about what's the quality of produced water. It's this black stuff that, it's very, very difficult to treat. And in reality, as was mentioned earlier, produced water varies across the states, across basins, and some of it is very, very pure, very, very high quality, very easily reused. Some of it is more difficult, but in some of the modern treatment technologies and pre-treatment technologies, we can get to a pretty high quality water that then can be treated through a desalination technology at relatively low costs. Either whether it's brackish or if it's higher TDS, at least compatible or comparable to some of the disposal costs that we see across the Western US. And so my last slide is the next slide, please. It just shows that here's the trend that we see with the price of oil and the demand for oil globally. This is just in New Mexico, significant increases in produced water. And if we look at the amount of produced water that would be available for reuse just in New Mexico, something on the order of 150 million gallons a day, which is essentially 150,000 acre feet per year. But to put that in perspective, that's 3 Albuquerque's worth of water a day. So when we look at the opportunity for economic development in things like hydrogen or energy or industries, we're talking about a lot of availability of water in regions like the Permian Basin and the San Juan Basin in New Mexico and other basins across the West, where there's significant resources that could be utilized and allow us not to rely on fresh water in the future for some of these energy that these existing saline infrastructure and saline aquifers, brackish water and produced water are at a point where they're either at marginal costs of new supplies of fresh water or have avoided costs that allow them to be used more easily. So that's kind of my presentation. And I think as we look at energy development in the future, opportunities for produced water and brackish water are growing substantially. So that's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mike. And for everybody else, we'll have questions and answers, a little roundtable at the end. Tom Lowry will be leading those, that Q&A session as well. And so next, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. So John Byram is a business development manager for process equipment and service company PESCO, position he's held since 2016. He moved to Farmington in 1994 and worked for DJ Simmons local oil and gas company, where he worked for 20 years before going to PESCO. He has a BS in mechanical engineering from Texas A&M as well, and he will be talking to us about his presentation, Regional Case Study in Non-Traditional Water Treatment. So John, the floor is yours, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to make this presentation. We'll go ahead and dive in here. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about PESCO. We'll click through these pretty quick. We're a locally owned company, been here since 1970s, mostly working in the oil and gas industry, traditionally. Next slide. So we've concentrated on making fluid treatment equipment for the oil and gas. So we basically separate the water from the oil from the natural gas and then distribute it on the well site and points along the way. Next slide. We also have in-house engineering and ability to design and so forth. Go ahead, next slide. So our market mainly has been kind of this Intermountain West area down into Texas, a little bit back east, but this is what our experience is and kind of our footprint for where we work right now. Next slide. And so I think one thing that's relevant to this overall discussion, we're a company here that has gone with the cycles of oil and gas. So looking for opportunities related to this I-West work, which is energy transition. We're looking to move beyond just oil and gas into water treatment and also hydrogen production, which I'll mention in a minute. But you can see with the oil and gas cycles, we've ranged from a high close to 500 down to below 200 in employee count. And now we're approaching over 400 again. Well, we are at over 400. About 65% of us are Native American, mostly Navajo. So this is an economic impact story as well for this region. Next slide. So we are working with New Mexico Tech on developing and commercializing some water technology that they have been working on for about, well, a number of years. But they've done pilot tests and now ready to actually work on getting it commercial. So we are working on right now building a pilot unit to be able to be demonstrating this technology. So the applications could be for filtering produced water from oil and gas, and also looking at areas where we have water wells that are currently being used that really aren't usable for potable uses. So that's another area that we're looking at. Next slide. So this technology actually uses a nano fiber technology. It is a thermal process. So we're able to move the water across the membrane and leave the salts and organics behind, the TDS and the organics behind. Next slide. So we are a member of the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium, the group being headed up by Mike Hightower, who just spoke. So we're one of the companies that is participating in that, along with a local, with a producer, oil and gas producer here in the San Juan, to be able to set our unit out and actually go through the tests on it. Next slide. But we're also working with Navajo Technical University that has MOU with New Mexico Tech, looking at water issues out on the Navajo Nation. And that group has been working to provide outreach, education with the students, as well as working to do some water resource characterization out on the Navajo Nation to help identify potential regions where this technology could be applied to address some of the water issues out there. Next slide. So this is a picture of our unit where we're doing testing here at our site. This is 5,000 gallon per day capability, and we're finalizing the site testing here at our facility here in Farmington and getting ready to move it out to a site in the San Juan Basin. So we're excited about that. A little bit about the test. We will be filtering produced water from oil and gas well, and then the filtered water then will go into tanks and then mix back in with the concentrate, and then all of the water will then be disposed of in the normal process of what the producer is using. So none of the water will be put on the ground. All that's going to be contained for this, and all of the water, 100% of the water, will be disposed of under the normal conditions that the oil and gas producer does. So just want to make that clear during our testing process. And of course, we'll be looking at how well we filter the water and getting results so that that information can be fed back to the Produced Water Consortium. So next slide. And that is my conclusion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for engaging presentation. Really appreciate it. Next up, we have Scott Hienick from the U.S. Geological Survey and Utah Water Science Center. So Scott is a geologist, geochemist, and hydrologist working for USGS, and he worked on his PhD dissertation in Argentina. Scott is working on many hydrological problems in the Great Basin of the Western United States, including questions of brine genesis and lithium resource potential at Clayton Valley, Nevada, and at Great Salt Lake and Bonneville Flats in Utah. So with that, Scott, please take it away.
All right, thank you. I'll move pretty quick here. I want to introduce you to the idea of criticality and sort of the global lithium scenario in terms of energy transitions quickly, and then move into work we're doing in the Western United States. So next slide, please. So this is a lot of the idea of critical minerals at this point is, related to an executive order that's now about 5 years old, and the list has been updated a few times. There's some references there. Next slide, please. And then as I think about, the I-West region, these things in black are kind of what come to my mind as opportunities. So we'll walk through that in a minute. Next slide, please. So here's a view of criticality related to lithium batteries globally. And this, of course, is energy storage, which is going to be an important part of any energy transition. And what you see is if you make lithium batteries, we have a huge trade exposure because most of our raw materials come from somewhere else. And then if you look on the left there, what we're seeing is projected demand for lithium, raw lithium, and what might be able to be produced. So there's a giant supply gap here, which is an opportunity, and a vulnerability. Next slide, please. And then this, from our work in South America, this is kind of what global trade patterns look like. Of course, there's supply risk, but also we're very active with working with the British Geological Survey and the European Union. And this global lithium battery supply market is very carbon intensive. And so not only is the EU moving towards pricing in carbon and water into their lithium, I think that other places are going to be considering this as sort of a, good corporate governance kind of considerations. So, all right, next slide, please. So we've worked for about 5 years now with Argentina. We recently had them in the Western US for 10 days touring Nevada and Utah, looking at lithium and water regulation. And interesting parallel is that it's a federal system. Provinces control many of the mineral and water rights, very similar to the United States. And one of the things that it comes down to is, one, they want to add parts of the value chain regionally at a scale like iWest. And two, everything boils down to fresh water for them. You know, globally, it's about carbon, but for them, it's fresh water. Next, please. So then I'm just going to show you some quick examples of work that we're doing in cooperation with the USGS Mineral Resources Program. And here on the right, you'll see a map of lithium concentrations in groundwater for the Great Basin, more or less. And we're using this is partially done. We're using this to guide some further work. So next slide, please. And so one of the things, you know, a place where I've worked for a long time is Clayton Valley, Nevada. They've been actively producing lithium in brine since the 1960s. They never actually claimed any of the potassium salts, so they have stockpiles of them. One of the things I think is worth pointing out is that there's an enormous value of potash, which can be used for basically fertilizer, sitting in these salt stockpiles. But what kind of the hang up right now is really the transport cost. So again, thinking about scale and regional, and can these types of resources be produced closer to where they might be needed? The other thing I would like to point out is the helium concentrations in these brines are huge. They pump 13,000 acre feet annually. They're looking to move to 20,000 acre feet, use their water rights as a way to basically keep competitors out of the basin, because that's what's allocated for the basin. They're not using it all. Next slide, please. And then if you look on the left and the right panel, on the left panel, the big hollow white dots show up as orange dots. On the right panel, these are different aquifers in this basin. And basically, as you move up those lines, you have increasing helium concentration. And if you look on the right-hand panel there, panel B, the lowest blue dot in a cluster of stuff, you'll see ASW. That's air saturated water. And most of these brines have helium concentrations 2 to 3 orders of magnitude higher than air saturated water. And in this case, brines in the right situation could be a helium resource. Next slide, please. And then one of the things I would highlight that my office is actively involved in is salinity control projects for the Colorado River Basin. And so there are a number of active projects pumping and re-injecting brines that are interacting with surface water systems or working on how to divert, you know, high TDS hot springs out of the river systems. And this is a sunk cost. So, you know, there's a lot of discussion going on about, are there elements in these brines that can be used to help offset the costs? Next slide, please. And then my final kind of example here will be from Great Salt Lake. We know Crystal Hot Springs puts about 2 tons of lithium a year into Salt Creek. Salt Creek has this approximate salinity of the ocean. So this water isn't used for anything except it takes on a bunch of agricultural return flow certain times of the year. But this is a tributary to the Bear River, which is the biggest input to Great Salt Lake. And when Salt Creek hits the Bear River, the chemistry completely changes. And so we know this is the major source of lithium to Great Salt Lake. We know Great Salt Lake has a good bit of lithium in it. They've been producing magnesium and potash out of here for many decades. People are actively working on producing lithium from salt waste piles there. Next slide, please. And then I think one of the neatest things we've done is actually look at the The interchange between the north and the south arm occurs in a breach. And so you have stratified flow. Essentially, the south arm flows north on top, and the denser north arm flows south on the bottom. And so you have this evaporative pump driving this circulation, and we get flow in both directions, totaling almost 40,000 tons of lithium a year. We've done some work on how this could be extracted, sort of using this passive flow. And it seems to be some promise there. Okay, next slide, please. And then I'm just going to highlight some challenges and opportunities. You know, it was, especially with respect to the I-West region, we don't know a lot about resource assessments, especially the deep water that will be produced. Typically, producing these materials is done in ponds. So how you scale that up is a question. But there are some opportunities, I think, as Mike highlighted very nicely, and I guess the whole session is non-traditional water has a potential to offset a lot of costs for disposal or treatment. And I think there's quite a bit of opportunity here. So then my final slide, I would just highlight that everything we've done in South America and the Western United States, the other critical resource is water, and it all sort of boils down to how that is part of the process and how water intensive some of this solution mining is. So thanks for your time.
All right, well, great. Well, thanks, Scott. That was really interesting. Also to Mike and John. If the three of you want to turn your cameras and mics on, I think we're going to open it up now to a QA session here for the next 15 minutes or so. And actually, I personally have a question to Scott right off the bat. Is in terms of the lithium extraction, is there, so two things, is there an advantage looking for like thermally hydrated or, you know, thermal areas where you're dealing with more geothermal heated fluids? Is there an advantage to lithium in that way? And secondly, are there technology barriers that we need to overcome that would make it more economic?
So, I mean, the geothermal and the way we've looked at it, you know, if it's being pumped or it's a hot spring flowing, that's an advantage. A lot of the ion exchange approaches rely on heating the brine. So if it's preheated, that's a huge carbon advantage. The problem, there are a few problems. They come to be the stability of the water and the amount of time it spends at the surface. It's never in a kind of an equilibrium state. So it's a moving target when you're designing an industrial process. There could be a lot of colloidal silica in that water, which would cause problems. And this has been sort of the problem in the Salton Sea. And then the technological barriers, I mean, magnesium is a big, traditionally this stuff has been produced in ponds, is how people get lithium out of salty water. And it's very low carbon. And, you know, you basically waste water that was extremely salty. So there are conversations now in South America about how do you recover water off of a pond? Would that be possible? But the technology barriers really revolve around scaling up industrially to these direct lithium extraction technologies. Most of them require a lot of fresh water to elute the lithium once it's been trapped. And that's a place where, you know, non-traditional or cleaned up water might serve some purpose. And then, of course, a lot of them require heating of the brine. So I think the real technology issues are scaling sort of these industrial processes that would not dig deep into freshwater resources of a region.
Interesting. Well, as I said earlier, water connects everything. So that's actually interesting. But so we've got another question here, and I think this is probably directed at Mike. But they wanted some more clarity on the opportunities for water in New Mexico, and if you could maybe explain a little bit more about like where maybe the low-hanging fruit could be versus other sources.
So let's see. One of the things about brackish groundwater currently in the state of New Mexico is that the water rights issues, and I think in many cases the water rights are available for brackish water. If you'd like to get those, the question is in the withdrawal of the brackish water, are you going to have any impacts on surface water, fresh surface water? And so you have to do kind of that modeling and look at those issues. From availability of produced water, the 2019 Produced Water Act in New Mexico made it clear that if you generate produced water from oil and gas and you treat it, that water is yours. It's yours to sell, and you can sell it to whomever you want. Once that water's put on the ground, though, it becomes a water of the state. So it's a one-time sale. So currently, the produced water has, I would think, more maturity in the sense of being available for supplies. I mean, you could use it tomorrow, whereas if you had to go out and look at a brackish water resource and try to get the water rights for it, you'd probably have to do modeling to show that it would not impact freshwater. You'd have to put in a lot of infrastructure. You'd have to do your own pumping tests, etc. So those are kind of the differences between the two as far as ease. I will tell you that in many cases, the produced water is much higher in TDS, often 50 to 150,000 parts per million TDS, which means that the treatment is more difficult. It requires a thermal process, whereas the brackish waters for a lot of areas in New Mexico are in the 5,000 to 2,000 to 5,000 parts per million TDS, which is much easier to treat and get access to, and you have higher recoveries if you go that route. So hopefully that kind of balances the two between availability and ease of water rights and getting it to market. Okay.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks. Is there opportunities for using solar and in terms of your thermal source on treating produced water?
Absolutely. Matter of fact, we just did a study process where a person was using waste heat from a compressor station in the Permian Basin and did a thermal treatment process using 100% waste heat and was getting 150,000, 170,000 TDS produced water down to 400 parts per million, all on it, all using waste heat from compressor station. There's big compressor stations in the Permian Basin, but it was all waste heat. So yes, I think waste heat, solar energy, any type of waste resource, these guys are looking at technologies that can now utilize that.
Oh, that's interesting. Another question here looks like it's directed at John. You mentioned your hollow fire membrane separates the salt and the organics. They want to know, how do you handle the organics? Because they say it often reacts with the membrane and you can lose your hydrophobicity of the membrane.
Well, that's true, and I think that's something a little bit that we're working on. We're probably not going to be able to handle high organics just directly with the membrane. We may need to be doing some pre-treatment, but the wells that we're looking at right now have lower organics in them, so we're not anticipating that to be an issue at this time. So the membrane can handle some of that, and the way the mechanism works, we're able to prevent that kind of the effect on the membrane itself. And back to the point related to the use of the produced water, this unit that we're working on actually would pair up to a hydrogen generation unit that we're also building for Biotech out of Albuquerque that makes about a kiloton or 1 ton of hydrogen a day, would match up well to this produced water unit as far as their water usage. So that's another thing to keep in mind.
So along that same point, we got another question that's inquiring about sort of combining some of these processes. In other words, could we extract lithium from processes that we use to extract, I assume they're talking about electrolysis, hydrogen. I don't know if we want to take that on, but is it possible to use those two in the same process?
I guess jumping in again, the biotech unit that we're building is actually an SMR unit, so it would be more hydrogen unit, but that's an example of the pairing of a water filtration unit that would supply clean water to an SMR, but it could be used the same way for an electrolysis system.
And can you get lithium out of the waters we're converting to hydrogen?
Well, our unit, it concentrates the contaminants into a lesser flow stream, concentrates it up to the maximum that we can get without starting to get problems with precipitation. So that provides a concentrated flow stream that could then be used for trying to harvest minerals out of that water stream.
You know, and I would just jump in with a point of observation related to oil field brines. The Smackover Formation runs, you know, they've been producing potash out of this in Arkansas for many decades, and they're working now to bring some lithium processes online. Again, these are the technological hurdles, but they're using 200 to 300 ppm lithium in this brine to make something economic. They believe they've not produced anything yet. The other thing I would say, just so you guys have concentrations in your mind as you think about this, in Nevada and Clayton Valley, their highest concentration ever was 350 or 400 ppm, and they're now pumping water down to 100 ppm, and they make money doing this. But keep in mind, their plant was built in $1963. So you know the cost of the operation is minimal in that situation. But I mean, I think, you know, concentrating something, you know, and then, you know, the problem is each one of these sources has its own chemistry and needs its own kind of process. And you need to kind of be sure that you're delivering something, you know, within a narrow range of parameters before you could really turn, you know, potash might be a little bit easier, but before you could turn lithium kind of technology loose on it.
Yeah, interesting. And I think, yeah, I think you bring up a good point in the variability of the chemistries, because that's, you know, that everything has to be specific to that particular location. So another question, this is off some that were pre-submitted before the workshop. And I just had my eyes on it and now I can't find it. Oh, somebody wanted to know, what are the barriers to using gray or black water reuse, and how can we implement that? Anybody has? Maybe this is even a question for the wider audience.
Are they talking about black water as being sewage treatment water?
I'm assuming that's what it is. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so gray water by definition in kind of the wastewater treatment side is water that doesn't have, it's gray water that's not used for toilets, and black water would be toilet water. And we are looking at New Mexico State, Peju at New Mexico State is looking at recycling wastewaters also. I will tell you that our recent evaluations of municipal wastewater is it has quite a few additional constituents that you don't get in some of the produced waters of the brackish waters. The brackish waters are generally inorganics and salts. Not a lot of organics. In produced water, you get the salts, some organics, and some norm. And if you look at municipal wastewater, you've got pharmaceuticals, organics. People use it as as a sewer, so they throw everything in it. So there's a lot more things in the gray water and black water, if you will. But what we're finding is they're somewhat similar. All of these constituents are somewhat similar, so the similar processes will work. Pre-treatment to take the organics out, and then treatment. A lot of them will have some level of desalination required because of the high levels of salts that you get out of from just processes, and including water softeners. So we're seeing that the technologies are similar, Tom, but there are some unknowns and some unique low quality or low quantity constituents that have to be kind of individually looked at and removed, which can make it somewhat more difficult for some of the municipal wastewaters right now. Hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, well, it answers it for me. I hope it answers it for the person that asked it. So moving on, and we're starting to get close to time here, but I think this is kind of an interesting, and it kind of gets back to some of the systems type analyses that I was talking about earlier, but is there a simple function or conversion factor that can take salinity as an input and estimate the energy to reduce it by a given factor? And again, maybe this is a question for the wider crowd, but if one of you three can have an idea of that first. I personally am not aware of one, but maybe there's some kind of empirical relationship that's out there that exists on that.
So there are, but it goes kind of in step functions. If you're below, and I'm gonna kind of give you the step functions. I think if you're below 10,000 TDS, you can use a brackish water RO membrane. If you're below 50,000 TDS, you have to use, or between 10,000 and 50,000, you can use a saltwater RO membrane and get clean water out of that. If you go much above 50,000, 45 to 50,000 TDS, you pretty much have to move to a thermal technology. So it's not a trend, but it's kind of steps, Tom, that you kind of have to work in. And right now, those are kind of what I would say the steps are: is 10,000, 50,000, and anything above that is thermal. So hopefully that lets people know that those are the steps. And if you can keep the waters below 10,000, it's easier. Between 10 and 50, it's much more costly. And then once you go to above 50, it's very costly. So you need some way to either recover your costs from recovering minerals, or you need to have avoided costs like you have in produced water, where you don't have to dispose of that by treating that. So those are the trade-offs you have to make.
All right, great. Well, thanks. Well, I think we're basically at time, and I'm going to hand it back over to Joanna. But thanks to the three speakers for great papers and answering questions.
Thanks so much. So we're now close to the end of this workshop, and at the moment we have time for an open mic. So if you have questions that you would like to bring up for one of the panelists that haven't been answered yet, or there's just a thought or suggestion that you would like to give us, please feel free to raise your hand, and then we'll call on you, and you will have a chance to ask your question. So go ahead, please. I see a raised hand from Sonrisa. Sonrisa, are you here? Could you unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity. And this has been intriguing presentations all day. So thank you to all of the presenters. I do a lot of work in stakeholder engagement for DOE around many of these related topics, whether it's carbon capture, hydrogen, critical mineral extraction. And I'm finding that most of the communities are very sophisticated on these topics, and they have very valid concerns on some of these topic areas. And I guess the point I just want to bring out here is looking for ways in which these technologies can be solving the place-based problems that are at the locations where these different technologies would be taking place, right? So whether we're talking about the Gulf South and legacies of cumulative harm from oil and gas industry, or whether we're talking about Four Corners region and water concerns and tribal rights, or even, you know, Salton Sea areas where there's huge environmental disaster concerns from, you know, agricultural runoff. And so there's very real problems that are in the area, but that are also very adjacent or very similar to what these technologies could be doing for the areas. So more than just causing a problem where people are concerned about water use or prolonging the life of fossil fuels or bringing an equitable development into the area, how can these technologies really start solving those problems by combining some of these situations? That's why some of my questions earlier were, how can we clean water at the same, you know, make useful water or clean water, remove pollutants at the same time as we're producing pollutant or producing hydrogen or lithium for an area. So I really think that's a really important problem that I hope we can get some, because there are technological questions to making that happen. And so I think if there can be more of an intersection between the conversation with folks on the ground, the place-based concerns, and the technology and the science side of it, I think we would really be onto something for this energy transition. And so I guess it's a comment, but I have a ton of questions still on how we can solve some of these place-based issues. And so I hope that you all are partnering with people in each of the regions and kind of bringing out these opportunities. And I would, of course, love to be a part of anything that anyone wants to ever reach out for or about. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Prashant, you have your hand raised as well. Could you unmute yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Yeah, so I had a question in general. So why has US in general been so reluctant going towards the thermal route for desalination, especially for these high organic content produced water and for going towards zero liquid discharge? Because even if you could go and look at Navi, which is a big hub for desalination, they rarely fund thermal desalination technology. So why they, and currently whatever the research has been going on, none of them prove to be very commercial towards treating produced waters, but thermal desalination can. So why the industry or research here in general has not been going forward towards the thermal desalination?
Good question. So I don't know the answer to that question. Maybe one of the moderators or panelists of the last segments is still here.
This is Mike Hightower. I could answer that pretty quickly. I think for the higher TDS systems, or higher TDS waters, like in many cases produced water, the costs of treatment are currently in the $25 per 1,000 gallons. And because of the thermal processes and the thermal approaches, you kind of have some limitations on how efficient you can make those. So I think even the improvements are a few percent based upon the high TDS values that you have to address. So the thermal improvements are not necessarily, have been looked at for hundreds of years, and they're just not there. They've kind of maxed out on many things currently using thermal technologies. And I think that's why you see a lot of work on the other types of technologies, the membrane distillation, that looks at membranes and temperature, or you're looking at forward osmosis, or you're looking at high pressure membrane systems. It's to try and reduce that cost of treatment for these higher TDS waters, because currently most of the membrane systems can really only handle up to 30,000, 40,000 TDS. So there are some technologies that I have been aware of, like the very high temperature, high pressure technologies where they can, that if there's organics in there, they can recover the organics and use those as the heat source. So I think that there's still some work out there that could be done, but currently, with the state of the art of the thermal technologies, they're just probably 3 to 5 times more expensive than the membrane type technologies that exist today. So that's kind of the direction that we're seeing, is more interest in the lower TDS waters that would be more amenable to lower cost treatment, and then you have to have some type of avoided cost or minerals recovery to support the higher TDS waters that require thermal treatment processes.
Thanks so much, Mike. We're going to move on. Arnel, are you here? You submitted a question or thought in the chat. Okay, I'm going to move on. I'm going to call on Arnel in a few minutes. Pamelia, you have your hand raised.
Thank you very much. So my question is, as we work hard to find ways to house the unhoused, is there a way of determining where there are aquifers in the ground? You know, New Mexico has such a vast area of land. The location of aquifers will be important for determining where population growth can occur. Can you help us in that determination?
Good question. Who would, one of the panelists or speakers or one of the other participants would like to take this question?
Yeah, I can take that. This is Tom Lowry again from Sandia. But so for the most part, the aquifers are pretty well mapped. I mean, there might be some small isolated areas that what they call perched water tables, things like that are unknown. But if you can remember, even the map that Mike Hightower showed during his presentation showed location of brackish water aquifers. And so for the most part, we do know where these aquifers are, and in many cases, we know their productivity and their availability of them. And you know, one of the main issues that we run into is that many of these are not co-located with the need for the water. So that's the other issue, is that even if we do have these water sources, you would still need to move that water where it needs to go. But for the most part, the location and productivity and volumes in these aquifers are fairly well delineated.
Thanks so much, Tom. We're going to move on with Christina. Christina, you have your hand raised. Could you unmute yourself, please?
Hi, good morning. I'm Chris Mulcahy. I am ESH counsel at Nano, focusing on water quality and water issues. Before I joined Nano, I was an attorney in private practice in New Mexico and Texas. And I litigated a number of matters involving water rights in New Mexico and Texas, many of the major stream adjudications in the West. And there was a question about produced water and how can we better use produced water to fill some of these needs. And one of the major gaps that I see in us actually using produced water is that the law and the policy, in my opinion, has not caught up to the science. And for example, in New Mexico, you actually cannot get a water right in produced water. There's a legal distinction between a water right and a right to use water. Produced water is a right to use the water, but it is not a water right. It's treated more like mine dewater water. And so when I was in private practice, I counseled many energy companies on, well, what does this mean for us if we invest millions and millions and billions of dollars in produced water gathering systems and we end up not owning the water that goes into our system? And so I think this is a major challenge, and actually New Mexico has not answered that question. There was a bankruptcy case out of the Southern District of Texas 2 years ago, which upended the understanding that we had about you own the water in your pipeline. It was a Texas bankruptcy case that was interpreting Colorado law on water ownership in a gathering line. And in my opinion, the court got it wrong for several reasons, but the court actually said, no, you don't necessarily own the water in your gathering line from produced water. And so I think one of the major lags that we see now in the West, certainly in Colorado and in New Mexico, who has very similar laws on water rights and water right ownership, is that the law and the policy has not caught up to the science and the need. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We have time for two more quick questions or comments. Philip, you are next in line. Are you here? Could you unmute yourself, please? Philip Moss. Okay, then let's move on to Catherine first. So Catherine, are you here? You have your hand raised as well.
Yes, I am. Hello, everyone. I'm a concerned citizen and New Mexico resident with something of a big picture question.
Yeah.
Earlier in the presentation, Dr. Thompson noted that the water requirements for solar, PV, and wind were minimal to none, and clearly sun and wind are abundant in the Intermountain West. Given this, why is iWest placing such a strong emphasis on new energy technologies that by design rely on the byproducts of fossil fuel extraction and combustion? Thank you.
That's a good question. Who would like to take this question? George, maybe?
Sure, I'll step in, Yolanta, and let me put my camera on so you can see me. Thanks, Catherine, for that question. And it's a really good question, one that we've been thinking about long and hard in the iWest effort. So we're not looking at technologies that exclude solar and wind and other pieces. In fact, the low carbon electricity piece that we're looking at intentionally includes any pathway to that, which includes the solar and wind, as does the hydrogen pathway, which includes solar as a pathway to green hydrogen. But when you look at the overall issue of getting to carbon neutral, those pathways that rely on solar and wind are not likely to get us to carbon neutral in the time scale that we need currently, and for a variety of reasons. One of which was alluded to by Scott's presentation, where he looked at the supply chain needs for lithium if we were to use solar and battery to help load balance that. And so, in iWest, we're trying to make use of the resources we have, like solar, but also recognize that there's a very important need to get the region to carbon neutrality.
Thanks so much, George. So Philip, who has his hand up, his microphone wasn't working, and he typed his question in the chat. And we're gonna get back to that, Philip, after this meeting. So with that, I would like to hand this back to George Guthrie to close this workshop. George.
Thanks, Yolanta, and thanks everybody for sticking around for the duration of this. More importantly, thanks for participating in an initiation of a dialogue around water and energy. As Yolanta said at the beginning of the workshop, water and energy are important. Energy transition has to occur in this region because global markets are shifting. And iWest is really trying to understand that. What is it we can do to help this region position in response to these changes in the global markets to get to carbon neutral? John Sorrow started us off by noting that in this region in particular, you can't separate the question of looking at energy transition from the question of water needs. And so this workshop is really about opening a dialogue in that. And we appreciate you participating in that dialogue. We recognize that, that this dialogue is just a start, and we want to hear from you after this as well. We'll have other events that you can keep track of on iwest.org. The other part, though, is that we have listening sessions up there that you can sign up for a listening session so we can hear more directly from you on an individual basis or on a group basis. And you'll also see the previous events that we've had. They're up there recorded either as in written form or in audio and visual form.
So again, we really value hearing from you. We're open to hearing from you beyond this workshop, and we encourage you to go to iwest.org to set that up. There's also a web server if you prefer, a list server if you prefer sending an email. It's iwest@lanl.gov. You can also find that on the website. So there's a way to get written comments in. And finally, I'd just like to extend a really warm thanks to everyone who helped put this workshop together, the moderators and panelists that you heard from, who put a lot of thought into this. Very much appreciated. All of the logistics that went behind pulling this off.
I think George is having trouble.
Yeah.
Just got a text. So he said, thanks everyone. And, let's keep fighting the good fight for our iWest region. So everyone have a safe rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye now.